Okay, we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And last time we, of course, then finished off chapter 12, verses 1 through 31. We're still in the same block of text. It runs all the way from 1 Corinthians chapter 12 through 1 Corinthians chapter 14. So when we come to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we're right in the middle of a unit. Okay, we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and we are right in the middle of a unit. It runs all the way from 1 Corinthians chapter 12 through 1 Corinthians chapter 14. The issue, spiritual gifts. That is the mechanical issue. It is a symptom. So it's a smaller issue of a much bigger problem. The big problem is selfishness, lovelessness. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 has introduced that. 12:1. Now, concerning you asked some questions about spiritual gifts. He says, I don't want you to be unaware. He's still in the middle of that discussion in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Now he's going to address, so what's the solution? In 1 Corinthians 12, we saw the problem. There's division. So says 12:25. Because of the gifted issue, there's some jealousy. Some people are telling other people that you're accountable for being gifted just as I am, and that's not true. Paul says, what's the issue here? Well, he seeks to educate them first and say, well, you first got to realize this. There's a need for diversity. Not everybody can have the same gifts. You can't be uniform. It'd be disconfigured. The whole thing doesn't make sense if you try to say everybody ought to be the same way you are. He's not talking about doctrine. He's talking about giftedness. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, he says, given that, what's the issue? What's the solution? What's going to resolve this problem? And he's going to say one thing: love. The problem is lovelessness. What's the solution then? Love. If the problem is lovelessness, the solution is love. And that's what he's getting ready to say in 1 Corinthians 13. It's in the middle. 1 Corinthians 13 is in the middle of a discussion on spiritual gifts. That's the symptom of the much bigger problem. Let's go ahead and read 13 rather, 1 through 3. 1 Corinthians 13, 1 through 3. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith, even so that I could remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. Twice he said, if I don't have love. 13:3. If I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. 3 times in 3 verses, he starts out by saying, if I do not have love, if I do not have love, if I do not have love. The issue is lovelessness. That needs to be borne in mind, because when we get down into the latter part of this chapter, some interpreters have this knack for wanting to abandon the real context, and all of a sudden we're talking about something radically different, something entirely different than the actual context here. Let's go ahead and keep in mind that the solution is love. The problem is lovelessness. Number 1, love is to guide / govern the gifts. Love is to guide / govern the gifts. That's what he's arguing for. In 12:31, desire the gifts, desire the greater gifts. 14:1, desire gifts, he says. He always insists to desire gifts. But what love does is it guides or governs the gifts. It purifies our motives for wanting to be gifted by God. The next blank, if you have the worksheet in front of you for chapter 13, love is indispensable. You can't be the most gifted person on the planet, not have love, and be pleasing to God. He doesn't care if you are the best orator. He doesn't care if you do lead the singing better than anybody ever has. You pitch it right every time. You lead at the exact tempo. He doesn't care. He doesn't care how fanciful your prayers are. God doesn't care how much money you put in that contribution plate. God doesn't care how many visits you made, how many gospel meetings you have attended. He does care. He cares that you're active in the service of our Lord. But none of that matters if you don't have the right motive, the right attitude, the right agenda, the right love. Isn't that what the text says? That's what the text says. If I do not have love, listen to it. If I don't have love, I am nothing. I've known a person or two in my time, why maybe I've even been that myself, that thought he could be something without love, the right attitude or the right motive, the right direction. You can't. You cannot be that. Christ says through Paul, if you have not love, you are nothing. Number 13, chapter 13, number 1, love is indispensable. Love is not supposed to, here's your next blank, replace the gifts. Paul never says, get rid of the gifts, just be a loving fellow without giftedness. That's nonsense. You've got to have the knowledge, you've got to have appropriate doctrine, etc., etc., etc. If you have gifts, you need to be gifted. God's given you gifts. He thought you needed to be gifted. He doesn't say love should replace your gifts. He says that love will outlast them. There's coming a day where you and I are no longer on planet Earth, and God still expects us to have the right attitude or motive, whatever that mode of existence looks like. He's expecting us to be good Christian people. But our giftedness, our ability to be good orators, our ability to think, our ability to sing, our ability to serve others, all of that is going to disappear. At least that's what we're being told. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, love is going to outlast giftedness. So get it right. Get it right. Love will take care of all of the rest. If we get love right, your giftedness and all that other stuff will fall into line. I've known a person or two that's tried to insist on getting gifts and has forgotten the love aspect. Folks, the only development that's going to be good for God is a combination of the two. Developing in love is going to demand that you develop in an understanding of God and who He is and who He's called you to be. So there's going to be some amount of knowledge or giftedness there. But at the same time, you can't develop your gifts without love. If you do, you're nothing. That's what Paul says. Let's get number 2. The mention of tongues, he says that in 13:1. If I speak with the tongues of men, ... and of angels, ... That prepares us for the discussion in chapter 14. Chapter 14 is prepped for here a bit by the mention of tongues. He's quickly going to get into that in chapter 14. Number 3, without love, one is simply creating noise. That's true. Without love, one is simply creating noise. I've known a person or two who talk in the body of Christ. And I don't just mean talk, by the way. Maybe they do a lot of stuff. It doesn't have to be verbal. That's not the point. You can be a noisy, out of place individual if you do not have love. That's what Paul says in 13:1. You're like a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. You're out of place. You're just empty noise. Then, number 4, without love, the usage of the gifts fails to edify. What's that word edify mean? It's going to become a favorite of Paul in chapter 14, especially. Edify, oikodome, isn't it? Isn't that the word, the Greek word oikodome? For edify, he uses it in 14:3, 14:4, 14:5, 14:12, 14:17. 14:26, edification. What is that word edify? Building up, encouraging, establishing, building up, edify. That's what he means. Love, without it, the gifts won't edify. Old adage, but a true adage. They told us all, everybody told us this in preaching school. They will not care how much you know until they know how much you care. That's love. Love is going to provide an opportunity for using the gifts unto edification. And that's the purpose of the gifts. What's the purpose of the gifts? Back to 12:7. The manifestation of the Spirit, the gifts, is for the common good. It's not for a selfish endeavor. It's not for my own agenda. The purpose of gifts is for the common good, for edification. And so in chapter 13 and verse 2, when he says prophecy, mysteries, knowledge, If I have all faith as to remove mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing. You will not edify and use your gifts appropriately if you do not have an actual, authentic, legitimate care for people. So if you do not care for people and you're watching this, you're listening to this, do one of two things. Number one, ideally, get a care for people. Start to love people, care for people, and commit to that. Number two, if you will not develop a love or a care for people, please stop using your gifts because it's actually counterproductive. I don't care what kind of sermon you preach. I don't care what kind of song leading you lead. That's what Paul says. If you don't have love, you are noise. You are noisy and out of place. And you're actually counterproductive and you're doing more damage than you are doing good. I've known some people who are gifted. They use their gifts and they don't care for people. And would you believe that you can feel the tension and the rot in the midst of a congregation where they feel that way about a person? He gets up and he's self-exalting and he's arrogant and he doesn't care for people and does things his own way all the time. Doesn't spend time with the brethren, doesn't relate to them, doesn't communicate with them. But he uses his gift. And his gift is to lead the singing, or his gift is to preach a mean sermon. Those people are actually doing more harm to the cause of Christ than they realize. God help us, me, try to do better and not be like that. In 1 Corinthians 13, if we do not have love, the gifts and our usage of them fails to edify. Number 5, the reference to having faith. If you look at 13:2, if I have all faith even to remove mountains, that's probably an echo of the teachings of Jesus. And I've got some verses there in the workbook, Matthew 17:20, 21:21, Isaiah 40, verse 4. Probably echoes the teachings of Jesus. He had said some things like that to the disciples. Isaiah 40 and verse 4 is an interesting little echo if you develop the Old Testament understanding of it there. Number 6, all of these elements, he lists 3. More than 3, really. Prophecy, mysteries, and knowledge. Those are 3 that we'll come back to in a moment. Prophecy, mysteries, knowledge. If I have faith so as to remove mountains but don't have love, I'm nothing. 13:3. 13:3. If I give my possessions, he's a contributor. I surrender my body, he doesn't mind taking persecution. But if I have not love, it profits me. All of these things were in Paul's experience. There's your next blank. Paul's experience. All of these things were in Paul's experience. He knew about speaking in tongues. He knew about prophecy. He knew about mysteries and knowledge. He knew about faith moving mountains. He knew about giving of possessions. He knew about surrendering his body. I've got some references there for you. Paul knew about these things. So when he calls them to love, this is not an empty call. This is quite full of substance. Paul is calling on them to love as he's developed love. And was Paul always that way? I don't think so. We'll spend some time in 2 Corinthians next quarter in school talking about Paul's view in 2 Corinthians prior to coming to see the cross for what it was. Paul transformed and was still transforming at the time he wrote this. But Paul came to see love, the love of Christ, the word of the cross of Christ, in a new light. He's speaking from experience. Let's get 1 Corinthians chapter 13, 4 through 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verses 4 through 7. He says it this way. He says, love is patient. Love is kind. It is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant. Verse 5, love does not act unbecomingly. Love does not seek its own. Love is not provoked. Love does not take into account a wrong suffered. Verse 6, love does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but love rejoices with the truth. 13:7, love bears all things. Love believes all things. Love hopes all things. Love endures all things. Okay, let's unpack this little block here. Love does a number of things. I should say this. Not all, but most, and I mean most, of these words in 4 through 7 patient, jealous, kind, arrogant, brag, unbecoming, etc., 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 etc. Most of these words have actually been in the epistle earlier in the Greek text. Now, why is that important? Because Paul's not writing to Corinth about love in some abstract, unrelated, distant manner. Paul is writing to them about love, about issues that he's already addressed. He's already used a number of these words and told them to stop being arrogant, puffed up. He's already told them to be righteous rather than unrighteous. He's already told them not to act with lewdness, but to act becomingly. He's already told them to be patient and to be kind. He's already told them not to be jealous. So when he gets to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, he's almost getting, if he's not, he is almost getting to the summation of the whole epistle, where he says, now let me tell you about the solution for the problem at Corinth: lovelessness, selfishness. The solution is love. He is here getting very close, if not here, to the climax of the letter. The letter's climax is, so here's the solution: love one another. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sounds like Jesus almost in John chapter 13. Wow, makes sense. It's what Jesus said. Why would Paul think that? It's what Jesus said. He's going to think like the master, like the Lord. And he's going to see that the real solution is getting the love issue right. Until we get that issue right, all of the other stuff is simply empty chatter. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is the solution to all of it, is the solution to the problem at Corinth. Yeah, all these other things will be right. You wouldn't take your brethren to court if you loved them. I've never taken my wife to court. Did you know that? Fellowship meal. You'll get along at a fellowship meal. You know, I've never actually had a problem dining with my wife. You dine with your wife, even when you're not in perfect agreement. You dine well together. Why? You love one another. Why are they having problems about taking brethren to court? Why are they having problems about, I'll eat what I want to eat and I don't care who I offend? Why are they having problems at the fellowship meal? Not sharing with one another. Is it lovelessness? It's what it looks like. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, you get love right and those things start to fade away, don't they? You don't have those issues with the people you love. And the people who are ultra against the need for love, they have their stupid, I don't say that much, but I hate this mindset. We preach too much on that love stuff, or we need more hellfire and brimstone, that kind of preaching. The people saying that business, let me say this, don't have a clue what's going on. And every time they hear the word love, whether it's from the lips of Drew, whether it's from the lips of Paul, whether it's from the lips of Jesus, they can't stand the word love. They love to make issues, they love to divide, and they hate people. And you know the interesting thing about it? When they have somebody close to them that gives them what they want, usually it's some selfish, ungodly desire, they act all nice and flattering and smooth, and they know how to act when they want something. They don't know how to act when it forces them to be selfless and sacrificial. Paul says you get love right, and all this other stuff takes care of itself. So what's your issue? You're struggling with an issue in your congregation, a marriage, divorce, or remarriage? You're struggling with an issue at your congregation about the thermostat? Can't get the women and the men to get on the same page? Or there's one brother who likes at this temperature and there's a lady who likes at that temperature? What's the issue at your congregation? You can't get workers? You're struggling with people that are active? Here's the issue. You get love right. Love for God and love for neighbor. That's what Jesus said, Matthew 22. It all hinges there. Love your God, love your neighbor. All of the others hinge on that. That's what he said, Matthew 22, 37 through 40. Master, what's the greatest teaching in the law? Love your God, love your neighbor. Matthew 22, 37 through 40. So we'll not hear any more of this business from anybody who says we say too much about love. You need to take that up with somebody. Take it up with Jesus. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 7. These words have shown up in the epistle before. They confront the issue at Corinth. Let's get number 7. Love is not jealous. That's your blank. Number 7. Love is not jealous. Same word that Paul used of the church in 1 Corinthians 3:3. He said it this way in 1 Corinthians 3:3. You are still jealous and causing strife among you. 3:3. Number 8. Love is not arrogant. Love is not arrogant. Same word for puffed up. Love doesn't do that junk. Number 9, and I've got references there where the word puffed up or arrogant shows up in the English text. It's from the same Greek word. Number 9, love does not act rude. Same word as in 1 Corinthians 7:36. And then also it calls to mind the misconduct in chapters 5 and 6, sexual problems specifically. Love's not involved in that business. Number 10, love does not rejoice in unrighteousness. Same word back in chapter 6 that's probably understood as injustice. Injustice. 1 Corinthians 6, 1 through 11. An unrighteous or an unjust action. Love doesn't act that way. No. Love is just, is what Paul's saying. Number 11. At this point, then, Corinth should be familiar with Paul's contrast. He is setting love and all that it looks like over against the typical Corinthian behavior. Yeah, that's right. That's right. There's Corinth's way and there's Christ's way, which functions under this subheading or this overarching heading, love. Which one you want to be? Corinthian, Greco-Roman, philosopher type? Or do you want to be like Christ? If so, buy into love. That's what he says. Love, and here's what it does. Verse 7, bears, put these in the blanks on number 12. Love bears, love believes, love hopes, love endures. Bears is from the same word that's rendered as endures, back on chapter 9 and verse 12. You know what that means? Listen to this. We endure all things. We bear all things, 9:12. Why did Paul bear or endure all things? Well, first of all, love led him to it, but so that we will not cause a hindrance to the gospel of Christ. You know what that means? Love puts up with, love tolerates, love makes us patient, kind, wholesome, true. Love bears all things. It doesn't say that, well, real love, I believe in tough love, is what some of these individuals, to be nice, say. Well, the text says love bears all things. It doesn't say that love becomes a bear to all things. Then there's chapter 13 and verse 7. It believes all things. It gives the benefit of the doubt. It hopes for the best for people. It doesn't act sinister and try to find wrong with people. It gives them the benefit of the doubt and wants what's best. Love hopes all things. It endures all things. Love, I heard somewhere, covers a multitude of sins. We're to be guilted for that? We're to be wronged for that? It's Christ's way, folks. Listen to me. Christ hid or covered our sin. It doesn't mean that he turned a blind eye towards it and treated it tritely or naively and pretended it didn't exist. Christ is hard on sin. But being hard on sin doesn't mean that you've got to be hard on people. Being hard on sin does not mean you've got to be hard on people. Love does what is right by people. Okay, let's get our next blanks here. This is number 13. Paul demonstrates love in each of the qualities listed in 4 through 6. His ministry is, fill in these blanks. His ministry is patient/kind. 13a, patient/kind. 13b, love is not jealous. 13c, love is not boastful. 13d, love is not arrogant. E, love is not rude. 13f, love is not selfish. G, love is not provoked. And H, love is not rejoicing in wrong, but in right. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 7. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you look at that in the workbook, 13, love is patient or kind. It's not jealous, not boastful, not arrogant, not rude, not selfish, not provoked, not rejoicing. I've got references there, numbers of them from 1st and 2nd Corinthians only, where Paul speaks of his own ministry as being such or as not being such. Paul knew what love looked like, and he learned it from Jesus. He learned it in the real word of the cross. And if we recover the real word of the cross too, we'll recover the word of love, authentic, real, legitimate love, and we will act in a way that looks like 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 7. We won't have to pretend. No fibbing here. Met too many people who do the fibbing business. They say they believe in love, and then they do everything that's contrary to what it looks like. Love operates in this way. 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 7. Okay, let's get 13, 8 through 13. This is where we're going to diverge a little bit from a wider consensus. We're going to go a different way on some of this, but I'll give you a couple of people that I think should probably be read and consulted on this and have it right. 1 Corinthians 13, 8 through 13. So here he says, now remember our context. Here's the context. They've got an issue with division. The issue with division in this particular instance is the gifts. They're using the gifts like tongue speaking to break open the church. Paul says that business has got to stop. The context then is love. What's the solution? Love. What's the problem? Lovelessness. Let's keep that in mind as we get into 13, 8 through 13. Because some of us are going to want to turn here and say, oh, well, what Paul now tells us about is inspiration of the Holy Bible. And he tells us what they need at Corinth is more Bible. They need more Word of God. That's not what they need. That is not what they need. Something else is going on here. Look at 1 Corinthians 13, 8. Love never fails. But if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away. 13:9. We know in part or partially, and we prophesy in part, partially. I think he's talking about, I'll come back to this. I think he's talking about quality rather than quantity. That needs to be stated a little bit more and a little bit better. But Paul is talking about quality. When he says partially, he's saying Corinth is functioning with a fractured, partial kind of love. It's an incomplete form of love. He's not talking about quantity as if they've got to get a few more bottles of love in there and they'll meet their quota for the day. He's talking about quality rather than quantity. More on that here in a second. 9, verse 9, when he says we know in part or partially and we prophesy in part or partially, he's talking about quality, not quantity, as if they have an incomplete Bible. That's not his point. Let's come back to that. 13:10. But on the other hand, when the perfect or the mature or the whole or the complete comes, more on that here in a moment, the partial, which is a quality that he's saying, your incompleteness will be done away. When you finally reach maturity or completion, the old quality, the partial, the incomplete, will be done away. 13:11. When I was a child, I used to speak like a child, think like a child, reason like a child. When I became a man, I did away with childish things. For now, verse 12, we see in a mirror dimly. Right now, it's dimly lit. It's a dark thing. But there's a day coming, he says, 13:12, when we will see face to face or clearly. Now, 13:12, I know partially or in part. But then there's a day coming, well, I'll know fully with maturity, he says, just as I also have been fully known. 13:13, but now, faith, hope, love, abide these three. But the greatest of these is love. Okay, let's get 13, 8 through 13. Number 14 in the workbook, if you got the workbook, love is said to trump even the flashiest gifts. Oh, wow. Yep, that's true. That's true. That's what he says on 13:8. Prophecy, tongue speaking, knowledge, He probably grabs at those three as emblematic of the whole. It doesn't matter what gift. He just grabs at three of the flashiest, tongue speaking, especially for the Corinthians. They are big on the tongue speaking business. We're going to find out in 1 Corinthians 14, same unit, same block. In 1 Corinthians 13:8, he says, love trumps even the flashiest of gifts. It doesn't matter if it's tongue speaking, prophesying, interpretation, it doesn't matter. Love trumps even the flashiest of gifts. Number 15, the phrase done away. The phrase done away is used in 1 Corinthians 13:8, 13:10, 13:11 for a total of 4 times. 4 times in 3 verses. He says, will be done away, done away, done away. It's from the word katargeo, done away. 13:8, he uses it twice. 13:10 once, 13:11 once. Done away. And it is emphasizing that the gifts are transient in nature. The fact that the gifts, some of these miraculous gifts, are going to be done away, 13:8, 13:10, 13:11, suggests something about the transient nature of the gifts. That's your next blank on 15. They are transient in nature. I do think there's an argument then off of 13:8 and following that says that the miraculous gifts were never intended to be here permanently. They were transient in nature. Is that Paul's focus? I think it's a very subtle peripheral issue. I don't think that's his focus here. I don't think Paul writes this to say miraculous gifts are going to cease. More on that. It'd be completely out of the context, for one thing. More on that here in a moment. So, number 15, the gifts, the spiritual gifts are transient in nature. I don't think he's only limiting that, by the way, to miraculous gifts. I think it's the contributing. He's saying these things are transient in nature. They're not the conclusion. They're not the focus. They're not the drive. You putting $1 trillion in the collection plate on Sunday morning was never the focus or the goal that God had. It's a means to a goal. It may be a contributing factor, but it's not the big picture that God has. The gifts, I mean to say, miraculous or otherwise, are transient. They're not the end game. They're not the goal. That's part of Paul's point, but it's a subtle point. Okay, number 16, verse 9 forms a perfect contrast to verse 2. Well, let's look at that then. Verse 9, we know in part and we prophesy in part. That directly contrasts verse 2. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge. Let that sink in. Let me make the point. I don't know if you're following me or not. The contrast is this. 13:2. What if I have all prophecy, all knowledge? Verse 9. Paul says, well, first thing, your knowledge is only partial, and your prophesying is the same, partial, incomplete. But even if you had it all, look at this, back at 13:2. Even if you had it all, you're nothing. Verse 9 is contrasting verse 2. He starts off the chapter and says, if you knew everything and you had the gift of prophecy that it couldn't be matched, couldn't be topped, even if all of that were true, you had it all, you're still nothing because the problem hasn't been addressed. What's the problem? Lovelessness. 13:9 directly sets itself over against verse 2, and he says, your knowledge is only in a partial state. Your prophesying is only in a partial state. He's talking about a quality. So let's get the blanks on number 16. The in part probably speaks of quality rather than quantity. He's not saying that they've got a bottle that's only up to here with knowledge or prophecy. And if once they fill up a little bit more, they'll have reached the real deal. They'll have finally made it when it comes to knowledge and prophecy. That's not his point. His point is about a quality. It's not about a quantity kind of thing. It's as much as he's talking about a quality. You're incomplete. You're off, is what he's saying. You're just simply off. And it doesn't even matter about the love, or it doesn't even matter about the knowledge, rather, and the prophesying. You're just off. You need to know that. You're off. You only have this incomplete or partial knowledge and prophesying. That's what he's saying. You are incomplete. And it speaks of what Corinth gained from the gifts rather than the gifts themselves. That's right. It's talking more about their status, their state. You, the Corinthians, with your gifts, are in a partial, incomplete state of understanding. That's what he's aiming at. He's not talking so much about the gifts as much as he's talking about the Corinthian status in light of the gifts. More on that here in a second. Okay, number 17 then. When he says, on the other hand, when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. What's he talking about? He's saying this, if I'm right on the quality quantity thing, 13:10, he's saying this. When you get the perfect, when the perfect arrives, whatever that may be, your status of partial or incompleteness will be done away. He's saying this, I think, once you reach maturity, completion, perfection needs a definition, a caveat. But once you reach maturity, your old immature status will be done away. That's what he's talking about. That's what he's talking about. Now, I need to establish that view. Most people say, oh, I don't think that's right. When he says the perfect, he's talking about the completed New Testament. I don't think that's right for a number of reasons. We'll see that here in a second. He's talking about maturity versus immaturity. What in reference to? Agape love. Let's see if we can't establish the view. 17a, the perfect should combat the contextual problem. Let that sink in. 17a, it should combat the contextual problem. Whatever the perfect is, it's the solution to the problem in the context. What's the problem in the context? Lovelessness. Lovelessness. You mean to tell me that in this issue of lovelessness, and that's been the whole context of the whole Corinthian letter, he gets to chapter 13 only to say this? Oh, by the way, the miraculous gifts are going to cease one day when you get the completed New Testament. It doesn't suit the context. I mean, it doesn't make any kind of joint to the context. Why would he all of a sudden now start talking about the completed New Testament? It doesn't sit in the context well at all. So that's one argument that's certainly probably the strongest. Doesn't sit in the context nicely. But then also, if you look back at verse 2, look at this. Even if I have all knowledge, if I don't have love, I'm nothing. Paul explicitly comes out and says that the issue is not one of the amount of knowledge. What Corinth didn't lack, they didn't lack Bible, I mean to say. Paul didn't need to write 3 more letters and then finally they'd be the perfect and have completed whatever he's talking about here. Paul explicitly says in relation to the problem, even if you had all knowledge, even if you had more Bible, that's not going to solve the problem you're dealing with. They didn't need more Bible at Corinth. The solution, what they needed, was more agape love. Now that sits in the context much better, don't you think? You still may not be sure what I'm arguing the perfect is. More on that here in a second. Number 17b. The perfect forms a contrast with the partial, or I probably should have put incomplete. The incomplete, childish, dark, or mirror state that Corinth was in. The perfect is a contrast. Think about it. He uses at least 3 illustrations, maybe 4. 3 illustrations. Incompletion compared to completion. That's 13:10. The perfect is completion, whereas the partial is incompletion or immaturity. Immaturity to maturity. Does he make that argument again? Yeah, 13:11. Childish, infancy, set over against when I became a man. The contrast is with the perfect, the mature state. The third illustration he gives is the darkened state as compared to a clear state. Now, we see in a mirror dimly. There's coming a day, Corinth, where we see it face to face or clearly. 3 illustrations. Maturity and immaturity. Child to adulthood, man. And the third one being a dark, dimly lit mirror to a clear vision. 3 illustrations. Contrast. There's a contrast that's being formed. The perfect is set over against those incomplete, immature statuses. That's what he's arguing for. And then C, the perfect should completely replace the former done away state. It should completely replace the former done away state. I'm not going to belabor that point. So 17's got an asterisk there at the bottom. The completed revelation view fails. Here's what I mean by that. When we say, well, the in part stuff is the miraculous gifts, and when the perfect comes is the completed New Testament, then the partial will be done away. I don't think that the completed New Testament view fits well there in 13:10. When he says when the perfect comes, he's talking about, I think, the perfect, and this is your blank there. It's referring to maturity in reference to agape love. Now, let me make an argument that I don't have in the workbook. The words you've got here on 13:10 for perfect, 13:10 perfect, or mature, when the mature comes, when the complete comes, is the same word that you've got used, for instance, in chapter 2 and verse 6. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 6, we speak wisdom among those who are mature. Same word in the Greek text as in 13 and verse 10, the perfect or the mature. We speak this to the perfect or to the mature ones. 2:6. It's the same word as in 14:20. In your thinking, be mature. On the other hand, he takes the maturity, 2:6, 13:10, 14:20, and in all three of these cases, it's a consistent problem in running throughout the whole Corinthian letter. It's running throughout the entire letter. This problem is not just about spiritual gifts, you see. The problem is deeper than just the miraculous gifts. He uses the word mature 3 times. 2:6, 13:10, 14:20. The mature sets itself over, watch it, sets itself over against 3 and verse 1. Infants in Christ. I couldn't speak to you as to spiritual, to the mature, to the perfect, to the complete. Instead, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3:1, I had to address you as infants. Infants. In chapter 13 and verse 11, he uses the same Greek word. I was a child. Nepios. Infants. When I was an infant, used to speak like an infant, think like an infant, reason like an infant. When I became a man, the perfect, the mature, I put away infantile things. And then in 14:20, do not be children in your thinking, in evil be infants, but in your thinking be mature. In all 3 of these contexts, chapter 2 and 3, 13:10 and 11, 14:20, Paul makes a contrast between an infantile state and a mature state. What has the problem been in the entire Corinthian letter? Miraculous gifts and completed revelation? No. No. The consistent problem in Corinthian letter is this: lovelessness. What do you think Paul's saying when he says, when the perfect arrives, this old, childish, incomplete, immature, dark, dimly lit way of looking at things, what will happen to that? He says, when the completion, the perfect, when maturity in love arrives, this state you're in now of immaturity, stupidity, it'll be completely done away. That's what he's arguing on 13:10. The perfect, then, what is it? The perfect or the mature is a status. It's a way of thinking. It is in reference to this maturity and agape love. When you become mature in agape love, this old way of doing things, worldly, ungodly, stupid, will be done away. And that's been his consistent thrust in the book. Love will handle these issues. That's what the perfect is. Let me be clear one more time. I'll just say it emphatically. The perfect equals maturity in agape love. Now, do we have any other evidence for that? Let me give you a couple of references here. In, let's see, Colossians chapter 1 and verse 28, Paul has this to say, using the same word, maturity, perfect, 128 of Colossians. We proclaim Jesus, admonishing every man and teaching every man with all wisdom, so that we may present every man mature or complete or perfect in Christ. What's Paul wanting to do? Present every man as perfect in Christ. In Philippians chapter 3 and verse 15, he says this, let us therefore, as many as are perfect, mature, complete, have this attitude. Let us therefore have this attitude. What attitude? A perfect or mature attitude. And if anything, you have a different attitude, God will reveal that to you also. Then there's one more passage in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 13. Until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, a complete, perfect man. That's the illustration. To the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. In all three of those texts, Colossians 1:28, Philippians 3:15, Ephesians 4:13, he uses that same word, mature, complete, perfect. And he's talking about a status where saints need to reach. And who does he measure us by? The living Son of God. Let's go back to 13:10. He says this, when the perfect, in reference to a maturity in agape love, when you become mature in agape love, just like Christ, this incomplete, partial, childish, immature, dark way of thinking will be done away. The perfect is maturity in agape love. Number 18, by using the child illustration, Paul probably echoes back into chapter 3. I'm certain that's right. Number 19, the mirror illustration, as set over against the face-to-face vision, simply means clearly. He's saying that the mirror is dark, face-to-face would be clearly or quite visible. And then number 20, the timing of verse 13 refers to a time after the passing of the transient gifts, but before the second coming. Paul emphasizes that after the transient passes on, there is still something more abiding. Now, he says 13:13, there's faith, hope, love, but there's a day coming when the faith that we have, the hope that we have, those things will actually dissolve because it's no longer faith when it becomes sight. It's no longer hope when it becomes realized. But the thing that will still remain, the greatest of these, he says, is love. You get love right, and the rest of this business falls into place. And that sits in the context quite nicely. We're going to move into chapter 14 as he finishes off with a specific one of the gifts that they've had a particular issue with, and that is the elevation of the tongue speaking. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, he's going to come right back and say, I've just told you what the solution is. The issue is love. If you get love right, the tongue speaking business will work itself out as well. And so in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, we have one context dealing with the mechanical issue of the spiritual gifts. In chapter 13, Paul gives us our solution. He says, you get love right, you've got a reason to desire giftedness. It purifies your motives for wanting gifts, and everything else will fall into place. When we love God and we love our neighbor, these issues like spiritual gifts, thermostat, carpet color, those things become quite peripheral and secondary. We almost even forget that they're issues if we learn to love God and subsequently we learn to love our neighbor. The problem that Corinth is having is selfishness and lovelessness. Paul gives them their solution. It starts with love.